How did a massive passenger ferry carrying over 200 people nearly collide with a submerged Royal Navy submarine? And more importantly, how did nobody see it coming until it was almost too late? This is the story of a near disaster in the icy waters of the North Channel, a miscalculation that could have ended in tragedy, and the mistakes that led to one of the closest calls in recent maritime history. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a deep dive into real-life accidents and disasters. To understand what happened, we need to go back to the early afternoon of November 6th, 2018. The Stena Superfast VII, a roll-on, roll-off ferry operated by Stena Line, had just departed Belfast, Northern Ireland, on its regular route to Cairnree in Scotland. On board were 215 passengers, 67 crew members, and over 1,000 tons of cargo. The crossing was routine, at least it should have been. Unbeknownst to the ferry's crew, beneath the waves of the North Channel, a Royal Navy nuclear-powered submarine was conducting pre-deployment safety training. The submarine was at periscope depth, just below the surface, running silent. It had a crew of highly trained officers and submariners, many of whom were undergoing an intensive training exercise under the supervision of the Royal Navy's Flag Officer Sea Training Programme. But despite the best training and technology on both vessels, something was about to go very, very wrong. At 12:43 p.m, the submarine's periscope watchkeeper, a trainee, reported a new surface contact. A ferry approaching from the southwest. Using a combination of sonar and visual identification, the submarine's officer of the watch estimated that the ferry was at a range of 9,000 to 10,000 yards. The submarine command team took note, assuming they had ample time before any risk of a close encounter, but they were wrong. Minutes later, as the ferry continued its approach, the submarine's navigating officer took over the periscope watch. The estimated range of the ferry had now dropped to 6,000 yards, and its bearing was steady, meaning a potential collision course. In response, the officer of the watch made a critical decision. He ordered the submarine to turn to port, believing this would increase the distance between the vessels. But in reality, this maneuver put the submarine directly in the ferry's path. Above the water, the bridge team of the Stena Superfast VII was completely unaware of the danger lurking below. The chief officer, who was the officer of the watch, was focused on navigating through moderate sea conditions and maintaining course towards the next waypoint. Then, at exactly 12:54 p.m, the ship's lookout spotted something unusual. A faint wake cutting through the surface of the water. It took just seconds for the realization to set in. This was a submarine's periscope, and it was too close. Acting quickly, the lookout shouted a warning. The officer of the watch rushed to the window, spotting the periscope himself, and immediately ordered a hard turn to port. The ferry began to veer off course, just as the submarine passed within 250 yards of its original path. To put that into perspective, that's barely 2 ship lengths away from what could have been a catastrophic collision. Inside the submarine's control room, however, the situation was perceived very differently. Based on their instruments, the submarine's commanding officer believed the ferry's closest point of approach had been around 1,000 yards, 4 times the actual distance. With no realization of just how close they had come to disaster, the submarine remained at periscope depth and continued its training. The event wasn't even reported to naval authorities at first. It wasn't until the Stena Superfast VII's captain radioed Belfast Coast Guard later that afternoon that the gravity of the situation became apparent. The Maritime Accident Investigation Branch launched an inquiry, revealing a series of miscalculations and systemic issues that had almost led to disaster. So, how did two highly trained crews on two technologically advanced vessels nearly collide without either side realizing the full extent of the danger? The investigation revealed several critical failures. First, the submarine's crew consistently overestimated the distance of the ferry and underestimated its speed. This miscalculation led to a false sense of security, delaying corrective action that could have prevented the near miss. Second, the decision-making process on board the submarine was flawed. When the officer of the watch turned the vessel to port in an attempt to avoid the ferry, it actually placed the submarine directly in the ferry's path. A turn to starboard would have been the safer choice, creating more separation between the vessels. Third, submarines at periscope depth are at their most vulnerable. Standard operating procedure would have been to descend to a safe depth well before the ferry came close, yet the commanding officer chose to remain at periscope depth, possibly due to pressure to continue training exercises rather than take evasive action. Finally, despite having radar capabilities, the submarine's crew relied primarily on periscope visuals and passive sonar. This significantly reduced their ability to accurately track the ferry's position and movement, leaving them with an incomplete picture of the surface situation. This wasn't an isolated incident. In the years leading up to the Stena Superfast VII near miss, Royal Navy submarines had been involved in multiple close calls with surface vessels, including a 2015 collision with the trawler Karen and a 2016 incident involving HMS Ambush near Gibraltar. Each time, the common denominator was an inadequate understanding of the surface picture and a reliance on incorrect range estimates. As a result of this latest near miss, the Royal Navy was forced to review its training protocols, emphasising better use of radar, improved range estimation techniques, and stricter guidelines for avoiding civilian shipping lanes during training exercises. In the end, disaster was avoided that day, but just barely. The passengers and crew of Stena Superfast VII carried on with their journey, unaware that they had come within moments of one of the most shocking maritime collisions in modern history. And it leaves us with a chilling thought. If a ferry that size, carrying hundreds of people, could come that close to colliding with a silent, submerged war machine, how many other close calls are happening beneath the waves completely unnoticed? If you found this video interesting, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into real-life disasters and near misses. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.